So hello and welcome to the Power of Transparency webinar, part of the Reimagine Talent series from People Science. My name is Jessica Oberto, Director of Process and Implementation at People Science, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour. If you haven't joined us before, we're happy to have you here. And if you've participated in our past webinars, welcome back. You'll find these webinars are more conversation between our panel of guests and the attendees. So at any point during today's discussion, if you'd like to include something, a thought, or you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to make sure we get back to you. Now let's introduce our panel of experts. As always, our webinar presenter today is Christine Nicholas, founder and CEO of People Science and HireGate. Christine founded People Science in 1997 to help companies solve their toughest recruiting challenges. People Science has partnered with many HR and TA departments over the last 26 years, including Fortune 100 companies, as well as startups in developing and executing recruiting strategies, enhancing recruitment process improvements, and creating solutions to tough recruitment challenges. So let's go on to our special guest today. So first, we have Kevin Horan from JSX Airlines. Kevin has held many senior HR leadership positions at American Airlines, US Airways, and TechnoServe. He currently serves as the Chief Corporate Sole Officer, I like that title, at JSX, where he spearheaded recruitment initiatives, optimized HR processes, and championed diversity and inclusion efforts. But next on our panel is Wei Li Chong from Culture Playbook Partners. Wei Li is a former operating executive who's led cultural transformations in large multi-unit organizations like KinderCare, Ann Taylor, and HSN. Prior to founding Culture Playbook Partners, he served as president of MindGym, a global behavior change organization focused on leveraging behavioral science, psychology, and research to help companies. Next, we have Joe Struble from the Clark Hill Law Group. Joe is an attorney with the firm, where he counsels clients on a range of business and strategic planning matters, including entity structure and corporate governance. One of Joe's practice areas involves the Corporate Transparency Act, which he will tell us a little bit about later during the hour. So welcome to everyone on the panel. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Christine.
Thank you, as always. And this is Jess Oberto, our Director of Process Engineering. She may mention that, but she really is the anchor for all this. Welcome, Joe, Kevin, and Wei Li. Just so that our audience understands, we meet a little bit ahead of time. Great conversations going on. So sometimes it seems like you come in the middle. It's kind of that way. But we're going to carry that on to today because there's so much going on. Yeah, I feel like I keep saying there's so much going on, but let's take a look at the numbers first, right? So the JOLTS report came out, which is talking to us about January. And what's been going on. And we added 9 million jobs, up from 8.9 million openings. This is job openings, which really kind of, I think one of the things about the jobs report. So we're going to look at JOLTS, and, a quick jobs added was up from the month previous by about 53,000. So we were expecting a drop. We saw an increase there. We're expecting a drop in the jobs added, expecting a drop in the number of openings, and expecting an increase in unemployment, because every economic indicator that ever worked prior to 2020 indicates that, right? All the financial institutions, the markets, and none of it's coming to fruition. We have the same unemployment rate for the past 3 months. Last year, the lowest unemployment rate was in January, and I think that was at 3.4. We're at 3.7 and held that for the last 3 months. So we expected jobs added to go down. It went up. We expected the turnover report to show us that we were declining, and in fact, we're increasing. I think a lot of the noise what's interesting, right? And anybody's welcome to chime in on this, is that we get these numbers and they really are looking, proving the strong work economy. And then the narrative comes in, but wait a minute. And the undertone is, we're supposed to be in a recession. Why aren't we in a recession? We're used to being in a recession. Here's our cycle. Here's our cycle. And I think what the entire economy is trying to understand is that we are not in the same world of work that we were before. Hashtag new world of work. You'll hear us talk about that all the time. My concern right now is the longer we try to say we know what's going to happen and push that narrative, and then that pushes things in corporations, especially the C-suite. It'd be great to hear from you guys about this. If I'm hearing this is the trend, therefore we're going to lay off. Case in point, I think we use UPS, not to pick on UPS, but as an example, pushing right to work at the same time that they're laying off and anticipating more layoffs, and then calling layoffs based on what they've seen from some of their competitors. So that's why this narrative is so important, right? And we have a saying at People Science that numbers don't lie, emotions do. And I think what we fail to realize is in media, there are so many people in our economy that have a voice with media and are pretty much town criers that are trying to get a grasp on what's happening. And because they don't have it, they're trying to fit it into the old plug. Anybody have any comments about that? Strong numbers and still a lot of voices saying things are tumbling?
Yeah, Christine, I'll just agree with what you're saying. And from my standpoint, talking to a lot of CEOs and just being an operator myself, I think one of the challenge, given everything that you're saying, is that CEOs and CFOs are starting to clearly articulate talent as one of the most controllable risks. Controllable risk is really what I'm hearing. How do we actually put our arms around this? There's so much volatility that we can't make sense of. But when we think about payroll, talent, all those things which we feel like we can control, how do we actually take an approach there? And I think HR professionals are just feeling so much more pressure to make talent in culture much more tangible in a way that resonates with CEOs, resonates with CFOs. I wonder, Kevin, your perspective as well on that, being part of the soul of an organization, how are business leaders starting to look at that as something that's really, really something you need to put their arms around?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head. One of our biggest foci here is around that whole idea of soul, right? So it's around our culture and having an open, transparent, willing to listen and learn culture is what draws people here and what keeps them here. And we draw them from carriers that pay a lot more than we do. But the cultures are turning in the opposite way in a lot of large major corporations where CEOs are perhaps not taking an interest. They're more focused on where they used to be, which is the bottom line of finance. But when you balance the finance and the people together and create a culture where people are encouraged to think differently, you know what? Both rise. You get a better culture and your bottom line goes up because people are innovating and having a good time and coming to work and doing their job.
And when you take a look at where these questions come up within organizations, it's interesting because I know Fortune 50 organizations, and Chief Soul Officer is a really cool name, by the way, and organizations like JSX that really are very people structured and people founded, right? And I think they are the ones that understand their value propositions and what that means to their employees. And it's interesting to look, and I think maybe one of the things that we can do, in the upcoming year is start to do a study on the actual profitability of organizations that have this kind of culture to help create, as to Wei Lee's point, the ROI. Mm-hmm. In any case, this is a whole other topic, right? That we could spend a long time about. I know, today's point is to really talk about what's going on, but really dig into transparency. But love the conversation. Joe, did I miss anything that you had to add there? Are you good for now?
No, y'all are. As far as the economy, I see it's staying very busy. So I think last year it was busy for in the legal services industry, and it's starting off busy this year as well.
I know from the recruiting standpoint, we've seen an incredible first quarter as compared to last year. Last year was kind of deer in the headlights when it came to most of our companies, especially, with the announcement of AI and things like that. So there was a big pause that went on as far as who are we hiring and how are we hiring. Still hiring was up, but I think the focus of that was kind of like, wait a minute, where are we going to go from there? I actually think that these numbers would be even higher had AI not had such an impact last year. But that's a whole other story. There's one other thing that I want to mention, or the first thing is that I for the first time read something that said, should we measure recessions by state? I'm going to repost that article so that people can see it. But I thought that was interesting, and it's done from the point of view up from labor. Like, should we start looking per state? I don't even how are you going to do that? But that's an interesting way. And I think at least somebody's trying to think differently in how we measure economies. So the question I would pose to the group, to our listeners, and if you want to just throw something in the chat about your thoughts about this would be great, is, should we be measuring the world of work differently? Or do you think that the typical measurements that we've been using, that we just talked about, the unemployment rates and GDP? Should those still be the guidelines that the economy uses? So we'd love to hear the voice of our HROs on that, our CHROs on that. Okay. I'm not going to talk tons and tons about AI, although we always commit to talk to it. But I will say this, we had spoken about being careful about what you choose and how you choose it. I will say that in January alone, I have seen 2 big faux pas of purchases and contracts that were signed that did not come to fruition the way they anticipated. And we are only in February. So more evidence has popped up. However, I think that transparency, as we're going to talk about it today, that AI is going to help with a lot of that. And I think a question that I have for the group is, what's been your experience so far with AI in human resources? So if anybody has any comments for that, that would be great. And the panel, any thoughts or any points that you'd like to make about AI today in HR?
I will say that here at JSX, we have been very limited in our use of it in HR. It's great for job descriptions. That's our favorite use of it. To be able to sort of refine a job description and come up with some thoughts without having to go out and pull a bunch of different job descriptions to pull things together, since we are still in growth mode and creating new roles and creating specialized roles. So that's really about the only place that we've used it, and to maybe help refine some emails. But because we are so people focused, both on our customers and on our crew members, we want to bring the talent in. We want to get the ideas in. And Christine, is we've talked about this for years. We pride ourselves on being entrepreneurial, and that in our perspective comes from having discussions with people who are creative thinkers, not necessarily with AI.
And that is something that does not happen often. How do you are missing data, whether it's, we were talking earlier about a Fortune 50 we know that's they're using a form of AI through text to interview production workers. They never meet them. They just show up the first day and start. But I think one of those big missing elements, and I can cite case after case of information that came from someone that was interviewed that wasn't even hired, that brought an idea to the table that the company was able to capitalize on, right? Oh my gosh, they're going to slaughter me in social media about that. But that does happen, right? We don't by the way, the intention of most interviewers is not to gather information, it is to make a hire. But quite often you'll get good ideas about the business as real. And this goes back to the point that Wei Lee was making, right? Do we even understand the value of the candidates that we're marketing to and our recruiting market? And then internally, do we even understand all the wealth of knowledge that can come from our internal employees? Okay, so if you can list to any transparency tools that you're using. We committed to talking about diversity. I'm never going to stop talking about diversity. But everybody else is kind of leaning. Has anybody else seen it? It just keeps falling off the radar. So in preparation for this, it's like, I try to look at each one of these factors. I do every day and read about them. I just am not seeing nearly as much media about diversity, right? So I went to Bard, now called Genesis, from Google yesterday, and I said, tell me about diversity in the workforce in 2024 so far. And then I did January and February. And it came back talking about defining it and how important it is. There was a lot of different points on it. But then it kept digressing into other things in the workforce. Like even AI was like, yeah, this is a really good point. And there's 2 good points that it was making. And that's transparency is really important. And that AI is helping reduce bias in hiring. Maybe, we'll see, right? Those were the 2 big things. And then it just started talking about other things like return to work and the cost of hiring, and actually left the topic of AI. So AI left the topic of AI. That's how much isn't going on of late. Right. So any thoughts around where that's headed and what we might see coming from it?
Christine, it's interesting. One, I love being in the business that I'm in now because it's really helping businesses make sense of culture and people, similar to what Kevin said, and the evolution of HR that's in right now, of making sense of so many good things that they're doing with good intent, but having a disconnect between doing the right thing and making an impact on business performance. DE&I falls exactly in that. We are absolutely seeing DE&I spend reduce year over year. The average tenure of chief diversity officers is dropping significantly because there's a lot of positive intent. And a lot of leaders, at least that I've talked to, said, there's a lot of talk, but I'm not really seeing the impact. And are they really serious? And what we're finding is companies ultimately are looking at their investments and how they're helping the business flourish. And DE&I, as much as it was a emotional, we've got to we need to get involved, we need to educate, it ended up being managed as a cost. So when we think about, from my perspective, think about DE&I, think about inclusion, HR professionals, DE&I professionals need to get in the game to figure out how inclusion and diversity helps drive innovation, expand customer reach, really integrate those initiatives in a way to help the business attract, retain more customers, reach people, and do a lot of other things. Because if you don't have the ROI, it's really not sustainable.
I agree 100% with you, Whaley. There was a lot of focus, particularly in the sector of aviation that JSX is in, which is more along the lines of business aviation. Following George Floyd and other incidents of companies coming out and saying, we really, really need to do this. And I got involved on the front end because we have great practices here, but I have seen that drop significantly over time for the exact reasons. It becomes seen as a cost center. What we've done here and what we're focusing on is exactly what you said. Take the D&E out of it and focus on inclusivity. And by focusing on inclusivity, everybody feels welcomed. I think what happened, and I was involved in the DEI movement back in the 90s when it was first sort of hitting companies, and the first directors of diversity were coming into play at large companies. And it was very difficult because you were, particularly with resource groups, because you were bringing groups who were sort of morally opposed and putting them together and asking them to make recommendations to the company that they worked for. And that led for some interesting training sessions that I had to lead, trying to get these teams of people who did care for each other, but had very staunch positions on different company policies, practices, and approaches, that it became more divisive. And so I think what I'm seeing now is, yes, equity is important, but it's more inclusive. How do we make certain that everybody, regardless of their background, that it just doesn't matter, you're included, you're seen, you're heard, you have a voice, and it matters. And so that's what and it sort of goes along with the transparency, Christine, that's what we've focused on here, is less around traditional DE&I and putting together resource groups. And I mean, we have all of that, and are recognized for our diversity. Just came back from the HRC Awards, where we were 100% again on the Corporate Equality Index. But it's really about inclusivity. How does everybody feel that they're part of the organization, regardless of the background? And if you can wipe away the stigma of these different groups and get that inclusivity, it just builds and builds and builds. And it becomes, to your point, your customers feel it, so your ROI is there. Customers come back for it because of the environment that your crew members are creating, that they want to be part of in a customer-facing environment.
And Joe, I will say one of the other things, I mean, Cameron, you always do such a great job with this. You really do. And one of the things that I wonder is it's easier in a smaller company, right? When you're talking 200,000 employees, how do you bubble this information up or down or sideways or whichever way it needs to go if it isn't systemic to the organization, right? So I do know, one organization in particular that I would call a legacy organization, meaning anything that's been around longer than 20 years at this point, we consider legacy, right? They could all be good to great now. I don't know if you remember good to great. It had to be. Microsoft could be in good to great in the 90s because it wasn't around long enough. But if you look at how that organization has done it, it was from the board, the constant nagging almost of the board to get each division over, no matter what the category, to make it diverse. I mean, I think when you really show that, and I'm going to try and reach out. I do know their CEO. I'm going to reach out to him and ask him. We have a case study with them that was pretty good, but ask him where he sees things going now. So those companies, I think, that have it underway and it's innate in them are coming. I think it's the ones that don't get it, which tend to, right, are the same ones that don't understand the factors that are controllable when it comes to people and how the organization really can make a change in production, not because Harry's just not working, but because if we engage Harry differently, things will come out differently.
Well,
That's
Christine,
a belief, right?
just to give you a very quick example to your point around large companies or smaller companies, KinderCare is a great example. 1,400 plus locations, 30,000 employees. When we stepped in, it was a company in distress, 14 quarters of decline, really struggling employees just didn't like being there. And to Kevin's point, one of the major things that we shifted from was it's the largest childcare early learning business in the country, significantly. And what we realized was the company, when it was struggling, was pushing a plan out for every center to look the same, deliver consistency, because they felt like that would equate to quality care and child safety and so forth. What we found was the opposite. When we shifted the focus to say, we want you to represent your community in the very best way, but we want you to bring the curriculum to life in that way, what we found was incredible emotional connection, a lot more engaged employees that wanted to bring out to life. If they happen to be a Hispanic community, an Asian community, African-American community, they were actually bringing the curriculum to life in a way that represented the community that they served. And we saw a direct impact on enrollment of families. So, it's just another example of what Kevin said. When you really start to unlock the ability of your workforce, or if you realize your workforce only represents one group and you want to expand, there's such a great opportunity there for HR to begin influencing the business to look at the opportunity for expansion and growth and impact. And that's where I think you'll start to get a lot of movement of what you really want, which is greater diversity and all those things that benefit that come with that.
So the uniqueness as it trickles down. So you have the, on the TA side, we talk about the EVP, right? The employee value proposition. And it's always amazing to me, like this is what the C-suite thinks. And then it goes down to this department, what they think, and then goes into this manager and what they think, and then goes into that position and by the time it travels. So I love that idea for DEI and for a lot of to carry your messaging differently, to really kind of start at the bottom and say, what happens with this group? What is the EVP for this group, and bringing it up as compared to taking it down. Love it.
And we have been, not to brag, but we are very proud of it. We have sort of broken the mold in aviation. We are a majority company. And we have, in terms of pilots, 39% of our pilots are female versus an industry average of 4.6. And 34% of our pilots are non-white versus an industry average of 3%. But the way we did that, everybody goes, oh, well, you must have gone out and set a goal to do it. It happened accidentally by ensuring that we hire the best people. But it was going to pockets of people that had not been approached before. It was finding those communities who had interest in aviation that nobody else had taken a look at. And not only were we successful in creating a diverse organization, but again, we've grown 100-fold since I've been here. So we've had a lot of hiring that we've been able to do. But not only have we grown a diverse organization, but as an entrepreneurial organization who's trying to do something different in a very well-defined industry, that has helped us set ourselves apart in our product, in our approach, in our tone and tenor, in how we advertise, how we market, because we've attracted, everybody. And again, Wei-Li said at the beginning, it goes back to inclusion and making certain that everybody feels that they may have a voice that's different, but they can raise it, and it's okay.
Organically growing your base is resulting. And one of the things that AI did come back with is that our populations are, the bulk of the country is somewhat considered minority at this point anyway. So our workforce in itself is pushing, because it is diverse, is pushing the needle on those numbers anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that would, all stand to reason. Good. Great info. Okay. The other point that I do want to bring up that AI suggested, and that I am seeing this, is that when it comes to diversity, companies are finally starting to share those numbers with the entire organization, which I think is a good segue into transparency in the workforce. We're going to skip over return to work this month, because we do have a lot to cover. And also because, there's some things going on, like I said, UPS showing the gauntlet down, but pretty much what we're saying is something that needs to be reevaluated, right? Because I think you've got this last ditch effort of what's this going to look like. Personally, for our organization, I will tell you that I am diving 100% into virtual reality, which, crypto and virtual reality kind of fell off the side of the earth, right? It's just like gone now because AI took over. But these things are really and in fact, there's other cryptocurrencies that are now being launched, right? And we're looking at a lot of IPOs this year. But it's interesting to look at what the end game is going to be with that. Maybe towards the end of the year, we'll actually do something about virtual reality in the new world of work for hybrid models and remote workers. Cool. So we're so happy that you're here today, Joe, because we know that there were new laws that were passed about transparency in finance within organizations. I know you've got a slide for us. I think, we always strive to keep our groups in touch with what's going on. So take us there, Joe.
Yeah, for sure. So Joe Struble, corporate lawyer. I do M&A and corporate governance. One of the areas that has changed this year and come into focus is a new government reporting statute called the Corporate Transparency Act. And so it was passed a few years back, but it has been delayed in implementation because there's been arguments about, is it ready for prime time? Because the agency that's charged with implementing it, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, has a history of not fully implementing certain reporting requirements that it has been tasked with in the past. And then those have shifted to other government entities. But at the end of the day, our allies kind of, I believe, pushed us, and members of Congress pushed the administration to go ahead and implement it. So the law went into effect with reporting required on January 1st, 2024. And what is the goal of the law? The law is really to reduce money laundering, fraud, criminal activity by giving more information to the federal government about who the ultimate owners are of various companies. And so really the targets here are criminal actors, foreign oligarchs who are on lists of not being able to acquire U.S. assets or own U.S. real estate. It's not necessarily U.S. domestic companies that are the prime targets of this, but everybody's swept up in it, okay? And so the reporting is done online through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network's website, and all private companies that filed a certificate of formation in the US are by nature subject to the law, but there are many exemptions, okay? So the primary exemptions that lots of folks will qualify for are a public company exemption, if they're banking, insurance, or a broker dealer, then they're exempt. Those are all kind of businesses that already have to report a lot of information to the federal government. And then the other big exemption is the large operating company exemption, which I'll get into a little bit more later on. Okay, so as a baseline, all private companies are required to report unless there's an exemption. So what goes into the report? Basically, the companies need to report who their beneficial owners are that own 25% or more of the company, and who their officers and directors are. That's called control persons, but they're also considered beneficial owners for the purposes of the report. So those control persons are the directors or managers, depending on the composition of the corporate structure, and the senior officers. And they really called out like the tech company officers, CEO, COO, CTO, those type of officers. They didn't specifically list VPs as required to report, but analysis just has to be done on what kind of influence those people have on the organization itself. So the reports for existing companies are due by January 1st, 2025. So this year, there's probably gonna be more guidance that comes out later in the year. So what I'm trying to do with my clients is kind of get them lined up, figure out what they need to report if they're a larger company, and then to determine whether there's an exemption. And then for clients that I know have to report, getting everything together. And in some cases, it's just easier to file, but in other cases, it's gonna be a rush at the year end. So the more we can do now, the better, because this is the year where really the existing companies have to report. For new companies, you have to report within 90 days of formation in 2024. So if there's a new company formed, then it has to report basically within 3 months. And that's usually a good amount of time to know what the capital structure and who's going to control the company is. Who's going to have access to the reports? Federal and state law enforcement agencies will have access to see who the owners are, and financial institutions, if they have a need to know in a banking relationship or a lending relationship, and they have the permission of the customer to look at. So one of the big goals of the Corporate Transparency Act is to integrate all the know your customer and anti-money laundering laws that the banks have to comply with to a centralized reporting. And that's kind of the big picture where it's heading. And there'll be some more regulations coming out with that, and also some more laws that probably go into effect trying to integrate the two. So there's a couple of exemptions I really wanted to talk about. One is the large operating company exemption, and this is the one that most private companies that are significant in size will qualify for. So they have to have a U.S. place of business, 20 or more employees, and over 5 million in gross receipts from U.S. source business. And so that's treated on a consolidated basis for the tax return. So it can be like a group of reporting companies. But the trick here is that the employees are not reported on a consolidated basis. So you can't look at a control group test for that to determine the 20 employees. So if your company has a structure where it has like a parent holding company, maybe an operating subsidiary, and then maybe another subsidiary that has operations here, and there's like a secondment agreement or something like that, you really have to look at that to see whether or not those companies are exempt from reporting on the Corporate Transparency Act or the CTA, because they may not hit that number of employees test to qualify for the large operating company exemption. The other thing is when directors and officers change in a company, the company is required to update its report because those control persons have changed. So as HR professionals, you all will probably have some insight into that area, and that may be something that you just are able to raise. So the goal for me is just for y'all to hear about the law today and know it exists. So if somebody brings it up to y'all or in conversation, that you're able to respond. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me after this, and happy to take those on. I also posted the link in here to the FinCEN's FAQs. These are really good and comprehensive. So, if you look at those for 15 minutes, I'll give you a lot of the background and the basics of the law and some of the nuance. And like I said, like the easy reports are easy and the hard ones are hard. So, if you need analysis on that, that's, something that we're providing to our clients. And just that's my coverage of the basics of the Corporate Transparency Act.
Thank you. Joe, do you think the catalyst for this is any particular instance or train of thought? I know there's been a lot of talk about, especially publicly traded companies, right? Didn't they bring Elon Musk in, and a lot of uproar about his salary right now? And
yeah, I think like,
do you think, is this like a gateway to further regulation?
I mean, certainly, if you look at Europe, right? Like any transactions you do in Europe, any money you bring into Europe as a foreign investor from the US is heavily scrutinized as like the source of the income, who's behind it, who the ultimate owners are. And so I think that you're seeing the US like as a whole get like a little bit more protective in that regard with looking at like foreign investment into the US. And this is kind of tags along with that with some of the big scandals that have come out. Like 60 Minutes had a big expose about New York lawyers helping basically foreign oligarchs invest in the US through shell companies. And then there was the Panama Papers as well that came out, where there was like a lot of foreign investment coming into the US through shell companies, buy real estate and things like that. And so this is kind of like focused on that aspect of it. But as a whole, you are seeing more efforts to find out who's behind the money, where it's coming from, who controls what, and as a tool for law enforcement. So this is going to be a big database. It's kind of like a dragnet for, I think, ongoing or new investigations. I don't think that, for the most part, we always say this, like the federal government's not really like concerned about mom and pop stuff, but there still are significant penalties for not complying with it. So everybody needs to comply with it, right? Because what we've seen is that if there is, we always say that, right? But then there's the government does have a tendency on occasion to come after the smaller operators or smaller people who think that they were just like, hey, this was like an innocent mistake, and go after them for significant fines. And so I would say do your diligence, file the report if you need to. If you don't need to file the report, find your exemption and feel solid on it.
So different kind of view on transparency for sure. But I think it all kind of comes together too, because I think if we like look under the covers on some of the reasons for this law besides the obvious, right? So I think there was a lot of investigations when PPP loans were issued, and there was, all of a sudden the government's like, wait a minute, this privately traded company has 4 shell companies, one attached to, a foreign entity that we don't want any parts of. So I think, to my knowledge, that's where I have felt based on that we saw a lot of this coming to fruition. And then I think there's that other thing of, the gluttony at the top and the 1% and, what's going on there, which then leads to our topic now about transparency. So Kevin, as always, has done, I'm a big fan of yours, right? Like I'm like cheerleader for Kevin. How can you not be when somebody's the chief soul officer? But I think you and I were talking a couple months ago, maybe, and you were explaining to me your philosophy in making sure that maybe the word we didn't use was transparency, but really that inclusive part of your candidates, of your thing. So I'd like Kevin to go over a case study that he had, and then Wei Lee too can chime in about, if you can, when we're done, when Kevin's done, we'll have Wei Lee talk about a different viewpoint on this. Tell us about what happened, Kevin.
So almost exactly a year ago, we hired a new senior level executive, and we thought innovative company will do something different. It was our first executive in that area who was responsible for a large part of the organization, who did not come from an aviation or commercial aviation background, no background in hospitality. That whole, we consider ourselves a hospitality company that happens to fly airplanes. So hospitality is a big focus of our day-to-day operation. And that person came in and sort of hit the ground running. And we were seeing a few things that we were like, all right, well, they're new, they're learning. We kept giving leeway for the fact that they hadn't come from the same background as the rest of us, and trying to help educate that person. But we do crew member surveys twice a year and engagement surveys. And we sent the survey out, and the feedback that came back was overwhelming that we had made a mistake. And it's because of that transparency that people were not afraid to speak out and speak up. And give us really good data that I then, as the chief soul officer, could sit with the CEO and say, hey, our people were transparent with us. It's not just that they're disgruntled. They're giving us specific things that aren't working that can be tied back to a mistaken hire. And so after much review and discussion, we sat down with that person and explained what we were seeing and what we were hearing. And he or she agreed. And from that point forward, we separated and realized that while there is value to bringing different opinions in, be careful about where you do it. At the end of the day, in a very structured environment like an aviation company, there is expertise that's necessary. I think the other thing we learned from that is it's okay to fail as long as you fail fast. This situation didn't even last 6 months. We saw the problem, we heard the problem, we investigated the problem, and we solved the problem. And as a result, we did our second engagement survey. That work group came back 180 degrees from where they were 6 months prior, which was exciting to see. And it was because of their voices that we were able to do the right thing for the company. Not to say that we're sitting in our crystal palace, but we were missing things that were happening, and luckily they felt comfortable enough coming forward and saying, "You got to fix this," and so we did.
Awesome. And when we look at how employees trust or don't trust, right? Or actually, there's a triangle diagram I was watching. Just we could put that. It's a TED talk and talks about building trust and how do I build trust? And you don't really build trust. You're either trustworthy or you're not trustworthy.
Yep.
And I think because JSX is innately trustworthy, your employees are getting it. And behind trust comes better production, more longevity, right? And just a better culture, a happier workforce all the way around. I happen to be of the mindset that if we look at these trends and we look at the information that's coming from the quiet quitters that are still out there, by the way, it's just not a popular term. It's pretty amazing to me because I saw a sign. I saw an article the other day. Remember the Great Resignation? It's not here anymore. Well, then I'm over on TikTok and everybody's resigning. And if they aren't resigning, they're quiet quitting. So I don't know, is the resignation thing really over? Because we're not seeing them mass flooding into the marketplace and we aren't seeing tons of people looking for jobs, right? But all of that, in my opinion, and transparency is heavily weighted on your ability as a company. How, what is your level of trustworthiness because employers are saying clearly, we look at the trust barometers and we look at what's out there. I trust my employer. So they're coming in saying, I trust you. I'm taking this job because I trust you. So for the most part, that's what we're hearing. But then it's up to you to show how much you should trust me. You guys did a great job. So much to unpack in there. But go ahead, Wei-Li. I know you had something to say here.
Yeah, no, I'll build on that a little bit. Just thinking about the people that are on this webinar, if they're business operators or HR professionals, and they maybe listening because they have major issues in their environment, and they're trying to figure out where do I start. And I think that's the fun part. So let me give some thoughts. And the first thing I would say is, which I was so excited to be on this webinar, if you unpack the power of transparency, I think one of the challenges most people think about when they think about transparency is just the act of transparency. It's an activity. I want to share information. I want to, empower people with knowledge and all those type of things, which is obviously good. But the first thing I would have your listeners think about is, what's the outcome of transparency? The desired outcome of transparency is to have your workforce feel much more connected between the work they're doing and the goals of the organization. They're getting the information that they feel, okay, I know where we are, I know what I need to do, I can contribute in a much more meaningful way. So that power in itself has a strong correlation to retention, engagement, as we just talked about. It also has a strong correlation to productivity. And that's the way I would have leaders, HR professionals think about transparency. Now, the key is, where are you today? What's your starting point? And that's really important, because transparency can go really, really wrong if you don't really understand where you're starting. So there's two areas I would have you think about in where you're starting. First one is to take a look at how you manage the business today. How does the organization manage the business? And the easiest place to look is the reports and what's communicated on a regular basis. Let's say every month. Listen to how the business updates are being communicated. Look at the reports that are being disseminated. And I'll give you two quick examples. One example, I'll take you back to KinderCare. We were giving every center a monthly 35-page report of every metric that you can imagine associated with running a high-quality childcare center. The leadership was communicating on a monthly basis an amazing amount of information. They would think that they're being very transparent. What that ended up being was a highly confused, overwhelmed workforce that didn't know what the most important things of the organization was. So good intent, really, really tough outcome. We just finished a diagnostic for a client where 100% of the leaders felt their organization empowered them to be proactive in sharing information. 30% of the individual contributors felt that they were not getting information that helped them do their job well. That's the business situation that they're in. So transparency is about communicating information in a way that the people that need to receive it understand it and know what they need to do about it. That's one. The second piece is exactly what Christina and Kevin were talking about, which is, what's the relationship between your leadership and your employees? If it's strong, meeting, there's credibility, there's trust, you employees know you're listening and you're going to respond to it, then you can start to leverage information sharing in a way to move the company forward. If you don't think that you have trust, the leadership team, they're information brokers, they're disconnected, there's not a lot of trust there. It's very hard to work towards transparency. We were joking before this webinar, my business partner was a CHRO in an organization. They had a town hall meeting. And in that town hall meeting, the leadership team said, oh, we're a fully transparent organization. We want to take questions real time. And we're going to answer any question, anything that's on your mind, please share with us. And one of the questions that was submitted was, when are you going to fire XX person? XX person happened to be an executive that was on stage with the CEO. Now, clearly there was some disrepair and lack of trust where some disgruntled employees were scratching their heads saying, does our CEO even get that person is a disaster? So we're going to put him in a position where he's uncomfortable being on stage. That's not a great place. You clearly can see a disconnect between the employee base and the leadership team. So you have to know where you're starting to then decide, how do we actually begin to build trust over time? And the repetitive basis of doing that is where you're going to start to get the power of transparency in some of those outcomes.
Couldn't agree more. And if you're giving out tips, I'll share one on the communication piece. So we recently, in the last 9 months, have adopted a very structured senior leadership team meeting that we do, structured amount of time, specific things we cover, time limits set around it. We do it every week. But one of the last questions that the moderator asks is, what are the cascading messages? What have we discussed in the last 85 minutes that needs to roll out to the leaders or the rest of the organization? And then we assign specifically who's going to do that and how we're going to do it. And it just gets that, it helps build that disconnect between the very senior team who's everybody sees as making decisions and the people who are having to implement it on the other line. So, putting that agenda item into your leadership meetings, and we're putting this agendaed structure down through the organization. So, even at a very junior level, one of their mission points will be to say, what do we need to cascade to our team? So, but taking the time to, at the end of the meeting, go, wait, we've talked a lot about a lot of stuff. What do we need to tell people? What do they need to know that comes out of this?
Kevin, I think that's such a great best practice that's very tangible, that if there's an HR professional out there, they could start doing that immediately. Because I find, with all good intent, a lot of leaders, they spend time with the board, they spend time with other people, they talk in acronyms, they speak in a level that they're really not accustomed to think about. Okay, now we actually have the people actually doing the work. What are we saying and how are we saying it to them? And what are those clear messages? That's such a cultural, there's so much power in that. I would hate for anybody to miss. It seems simple, but it's incredibly impactful when you think about connecting culture and performance.
Absolutely. And
I'm pretty glad that we have an attorney on here too, because in terms of, how transparent should I be? At what point, Kevin, do I say this we're keeping close to the vest and this we're going to share? And if we have this culture of transparency, aren't we supposed to share everything? Now, not that any of us should be in a situation where you're in a town meeting and say fire the CFO or whoever it was, but that's realistically, when you look at who's coming up into the workforce, those generations, they speak clearly their mind and definitively, and they look for wrongs to right. You might say that's their culture. So as that continues, how transparent are you supposed to be, and how do you manage transparency? And what you're not going to tell people. Is there anything you aren't going to tell them?
We try and keep it that way. I have a great CEO who's a little too transparent and causes me and our general counsel to get squirmy sometimes at various large events. But at the end of the day, we are not a public company, so we probably overshare a few things. And we've learned from that. We've shared some things that were still sort of in an idea stage, doesn't come to fruition. And so then we have to go back and be transparent about why we didn't do it or why we didn't work on it. But to avoid the situation that Wei Lee was talking about, where they called somebody out on stage. I mean, we do quarterly all hands after every board meeting, and we specifically talk about what we talk about in the board, and we use a large part of the board deck so that they understand, what we talked about, what we asked for, and what we told our board of directors. But even more important, it's getting beyond those big mass groups. So all of our senior executives here spend easily 10% of their time. I spend easily 40% of my time out walking around talking to people. And that may sound easy for people who are in a regular work environment, but we're in like 9 states in a foreign country, and several cities within each of those states. So yeah, it requires I'm out of the office a lot. But by doing that and establishing a cadence where they see myself, where they see the chief pilot who goes out and or the VP of flight ops who goes out and flies and visits every station at least twice a year, or the VP of hospitality who leads our customer service team, who's out weekly in the locations, or the CEO who on Super Bowl, the day after Super Bowl, which was a crazy day for us, was throwing bags on the ramp here in Dallas. Creating that environment where people don't think of you as a leader. They recognize you're a leader, but they don't think of you as a leader. So they willingly come up to you and say, I don't know if this has gotten to you, but it's a problem. And we had a station all hands yesterday, prime example. So we had about 50 people in a room. We were hearing some rumors that there were some things going on in the station. So I grabbed the CEO. I said, we got to go talk to him. So he and I pull the group together. We have a very candid conversation. It was a great conversation. But as we were walking out, one of our newest employees and one of our very entry-level crew members grabbed me and said, can I have a second to talk to you, Kevin? And shared some information that from an HR perspective was a nightmare. That I said, well, come upstairs with me right now. We got to act on this and take some things. But in my days that I spent at some of the carriers and companies that you named at the beginning, where that wasn't the norm, there wouldn't be that level of comfort or that level of transparency, use your word, where an entry-level person who I've maybe talked to 2 or 3 times, but he's seen me running around on a ramp, he's seen me loading bags, he's seen me working as a flight attendant. Yeah, believe it or not, I do that. Is like, well, this is just Kevin. This isn't the chief corporate soul officer. This is Kevin. And I know he'll listen to me and he needs to hear this. And that takes work. That takes dedication on the part of the leadership team. And when I say leadership team, I don't mean just the C-level. It's got to come all the way through. Because if it's just the C-level, it looks forced. It looks like it's, the management activity of the day. It's just got to be the norm that, people like working with you, and you create an environment where they like working with you, and they know that you're a safe space that they can talk to.
And I think the term authentic comes in.
It's interesting. We say that. So I speak at a lot of our hiring events, our frontline hiring events. And I always end it by saying, because we always have a question and answer at the hiring event before we actually start doing the interviews. And I always say, there's one question none of you asked. And you get this look like, oh no, what did we miss? We're not going to get the job because we forgot the right question. I say, the question you haven't asked that you really want to know is, what do you need to do today to be successful? And the answer to that is simple. Just be yourself. Be your authentic self, because we are an authentic organization. And if you come in here putting on airs, trying to be something you're not, you're going to have to do that for your rest of your career, and you're going to be miserable and exhausted. So realize this may not be the right organization for you, but if you're your authentic self and you get hired, imagine how much easier it's going to be to come to work every day, because you can just be who you are.
Another awesome statement. And I think authenticity, in my opinion, is the cornerstone of building trust, right? And it makes it so much easier. And it's true, right? Like if I interview you and you're not your authentic self, it's only going to take a very short period of time when you're here that we'll see that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, we've done a lot of work here at People Science around using our technology to say, how do we really understand the candidate from their authenticity? But I love the idea of, in the interview process, saying, look, all you have to do is be yourself, and let's figure out if this is a fit.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Cool. I know we're coming up on the hour, and I do like to go. Does anybody have anything else to add before we go around, and I'll ask you for closing words or closing thoughts? Joe, you okay over there?
Me? Yeah, no, I am blown away. Y'all are just like the top level of HR profession. I can just tell. It's like everything y'all talk about is so interesting to me. And I just kind of reflect back on it. Like for me, a lot of that goes into the mentoring of the new attorneys because like, I have a lot of work that we have to get done. And so a lot of it gets delegated down. And then having that conversation that you're talking about, like authentic transparency, is super critical because everything has to be reported back to me if there's any legal issues. And I need to know the importance of those issues as well. And everything y'all are talking about transparency just reminds me that every time a new person comes in, you have to set those expectations too on like what you like and how to let you know what the issues are and how important that is for them to feel okay to come to you with the legal problems that they identify. And that's their role, is to catch those. And I think a lot of that comes through, legal obviously is its own industry separate from airlines and such and childcare, but it's that feeling comfortable in being transparent and authentic and reporting back up. That's the culture that I think Wei Lee and Kevin are trying to foster. And I think when you say the word transparency, that word is scary to me more than like the authenticity and communication. That to me feels like safer words than transparency. Because I like Kevin said, when you say transparency, I feel like there's going to be like something that's said that's wrong or hidden or shouldn't be said and said in the goal of being transparent. But like the other words feel more comfortable to me as just an HR outsider.
Very well said, especially as an HR outsider. And I think too that the point that you're making about being transparent, people sue because of how they feel. If you look at every stat out there, why do people sue? They sue because of how they feel. They feel like they've been treated unjustly. If they feel like something's going to miss and ethically it's wrong, that's why they sue. Even predators on the system sue because they have a sense of entitlement. So if maybe that's another topic. Wei Lee, last words for us?
Yeah, I think I'll just build on what you said. I think it's human nature to want to be part of something bigger than yourself. And I hope every human resource professional sees that as a huge opportunity to connect the work they do to really help companies thrive and grow and be as good as they can be. Transparency is an element of that. But anchor yourselves to outcomes, help every employee be part of something bigger than themselves. And your culture will really start to be a significant part of the way that you perform as a company.
Awesome. Jess, anything to add before we get to Kevin?
Sure. I think, I've learned a lot today from Wei Lee, Kevin, and Joe. Thank you so much for being here. And thinking in my recruitment process mind, transparency really is an initiative that is healthy for an organization to take on. But I think it starts from recruiting, right? So if your company has a transparency initiative, having the recruiters understand that and be able to communicate it to the candidates. And then when they're onboarding, make sure their training includes that transparency and what it means to the organization, and that the managers are in alignment. So when the managers are working with those new hires, that the messaging is still the same.
So it starts with your market and who you're recruiting.
Exactly.
Kevin.
Couldn't agree with Jessica more. It starts at the very beginning, it goes all the way through the organization. Look, let me be honest. I may be talking about all of our successes over the last hour, but we've also had our fair share of failures. And doing this is scary because, as Christine alluded to earlier, you're kind of opening up the book that you haven't opened up before, and showing things that you haven't really shown or talked about before. But don't be scared as you start this. Take baby steps. You're going to make mistakes. When you make those mistakes, laugh them off. As I tell people, celebrate them, because if you celebrate them, you won't make them again and you won't be afraid to make the next one. But just keep moving on and keep moving forward and take those baby steps. And hey, if you're an HR leader, maybe you're the one who starts this. It doesn't have to be started by the CEO. Just take the initiative, take the baby steps, and get the organization used to it. Dip your toe in the water, and people will see how much success you're having and will begin to follow.
I think this needs to start from the human resource perspective. That's one of the key, because who owns culture? Who helps with culture? I don't think we all make the culture, but I think HR propagating this. And again, I can't say enough how it's great to have all three of you on here. Great minds, Jess too, right? Like all of us, always working towards the direction of elevating our profession, which is so critical right now. There's such an opportunity right now because of the confusion in the workforce and because of the confusion in the overall economy for us to really shine and take it to another level and show our worth as business professionals and really make those changes. Help navigate the world, right? Because you can't control the world of work, but you can navigate it and you can help guide it. And when I think about human resources, I think that's our responsibility. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'll invite you to next month. Catherine Zaki from Meraki Cisco will be here. She's amazing. Spent some time with her, watched one of her presentations last year and said, we've got to talk to her, really done it well in the talent space. The topic will be using HR metrics to build ROI. So across the board, like how do we take this data and bubble it up? Catherine will give us some examples on how she's done that, some other speakers too. Again, thank you so much for joining. It's always great to have these. I learn so much every month. Thank you so much, guys. Great seeing everybody.
Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye.